to make the decision on segregation was an abuse of judicial power. Now, I want you to understand this Southern Manifesto was signed by senators and representatives at this time. It's not like a group of people just randomly getting together and signing a document. No, these are actually politicians, Southern politicians, who are uniting together to try to fight back against the courts. Now, you also are going to have states try to fight back against the courts, which really leads us to the Little Rock Nine, which you guys know at our school, at our National Historic Site, we are going to have our governor, Orville Faubus, attempt to stop integration at our school. And at this time, he is going to call in the National Guard to actually stop children, the Little Rock Nine, from entering into our school. And the response of the federal government, which was headed by the executive branch, which Eisenhower was president at the time, so it was headed by Eisenhower, steps in to actually enforce that Supreme Court decision. So Eisenhower basically tells Governor Faubus, no, you cannot go against the courts. You must abide by the courts. The Supreme Court and the federal government is going to trump state law. Even if you try to call the National Guard, even if you try to gain resistance or feel like you have some sort of constitutional right of some sort, you cannot go against the Supreme Court decision, which is why our school is so important, and which is why it is the National Historic Site that it is, because this time in American history in which all eyes in the United States were on Little Rock trying to see, is the president going to step in? Is he going to let the states do as they want to fight back against the courts? Is Eisenhower going to let Little Rock and the governor of Little Rock, as well as people within the massive resistance of Little Rock, really push back against integration? And Eisenhower, the executive branch's response to that was, no, we're not going to allow this, which is why this is a major event in American history. I showed this picture down here. Communists infiltrated our churches. Now it integrates our schools. I wanted to show you this because I feel like this picture is really interesting. It shows something very important at this time. The fact that you have the Red Scare, the fear of a communist takeover. And with the fear of a communist takeover, you have people like McCarthyism, right? Using that fear, using that communism, that irrational even fear of a communist takeover to achieve whatever they want, which in this case was to stop segregation. So if you could associate desegregation, if you could associate desegregation with communism and make the American people believe that desegregation was an act by communists or was perpetuated by the Soviet Union somehow, then Americans would not support it because of that Red Scare. Which is very interesting, I think, because a lot of individuals abroad, the Soviet Union, for example, was actually looking to American segregation at this time in the 50s and was saying, well, they call themselves the land of the free, right? They're supposed to be about liberty, personal freedoms. But in reality, they're putting down minorities. They're keeping segregation alive. And if that's the freedom that they talk about, I don't know if we want that freedom. So you have a lot of communist countries, not just Soviet Union, but also China at this time, and they're able to use segregation as a tool in foreign policy to point out the failures of American ideas of freedom. All right, okay, so America as a world power, we're gonna go through Kennedy first. We're not going to go super in-depth. Your reading goes a little bit more in-depth to that assassination and a little bit more about like the space race that he's very, that he was a key player, designer, push for that. The only things we're going to really talk about is America's relation to other nations and really how it's changing real quick. So we have the Peace Corps, which was developed during Kennedy's presidency. as well as that Alliance for Progress. And both of these initiatives are designed to offer U.S. aid to help developing nations, to develop democracies, capitalist nations, and to develop nations that were pro-American. So that's trying to use not really the power of the military, but America's power of the purse. And if these nations are to developed, or to you take a third world country and you help that country to develop, and they have economic ties with the United States, well, now that is a consumer of American products. So not only is it good, or the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress, not only was that goal to spread and improve the U.S. image abroad, but it was to eventually strengthen our economic dominance as well by producing more consumers of American goods. All those lovely things in your households that you don't necessarily need with the consumer culture. If we can spread that, we can make more money. Now, the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I decided I didn't want to talk about it. I've talked about it before. I do think it's interesting, but there is a good TED Ed video on it instead. And so I want you guys to actually follow this link and watch that video to try to kind of break up, especially if you guys are kind of zoned out now that it's been, oh my goodness, a long time. Okay, longer than I thought. So in case you guys are already kind of zoned out, and the video does a pretty good job of kind of covering both the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. What I want you to really think about is how the Bay of Pigs, how that is really going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, if you guys don't already know, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the height of Cold War tensions within the United States. It is that one moment in history in which we can truly say that the United States and the Soviet Union were very close to releasing nuclear weapons on one another. You had the Soviet Union with nuclear missiles in Cuba. You had America with nuclear missiles in Turkey, both pointed at both nations, and really that escalation of tension. So if you guys will follow that video, you're going to really learn about how this plays out. One thing before we go on that I do want you to know, though, is that after this moment in Kennedy's presidency, he's going to try to actually step away from the Cold War, from this idea of perpetuating and strengthening our Cold War foreign policy, that policy of containment. If you guys remember, we talked about this last week. You guys should have read about this idea that we need to contain communism, stop the spread of communism, strengthen America's international influence, both economically, with our military power, and stop the spread of communism. That policy of containment, which understanding America's foreign policy at this time is very vital to understanding the policy of containment, because that policy of containment really defines our foreign policy during the Cold War, especially in the early years of the Cold War. So once we have this Cuban Missile Crisis and we have this kind of relief and de-escalation of tensions, we are going to see Kennedy kind of step back away from that a little bit and actually start talking about maybe making peace with the Soviet Union, or maybe understanding that their political ideology is far removed from ours, but no system is really perfect. And you guys will read a little bit more about this. All right, guys, so the Vietnam War, Johnson's presidency, as well as Nixon's. We're going to talk about Johnson's first, during the 60s. What I really want to talk about is not really Vietnam War, because you guys watched the video about it, so you should have already had that understanding walking in, and then you already read about it, so that's double whammy. But what I really want to talk about, thematically at least, is the executive branch at this time, and really understanding how the executive branch is really strengthening its foreign policy, strengthening what it can do, and strengthening what it means as a president to be commander-in-chief at this time. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, this is going to be the okay from Congress to start engaging in a conflict with Vietnam. The idea was, well, Congress is going to say, well, President, you are commander-in-chief, so therefore we believe that you should have basically jurisdiction over this conflict with Vietnam, and you should be able to actually put forth military units into Vietnam without an actual declaration of war from Congress. So this allows the president to step around Congress to do as he pleases. Now, if we actually look at American history, you're going to notice that the modern world wars in which America has engaged in has not really been deemed congressionally approved wars. They have always been deemed conflicts. And this idea of a conflict and Congress allowing a conflict is going to have these roots in the Vietnam War. You could definitely argue this at least. We are going to see the Wars Power Act, in which we have Congress kind of stepping back in and saying, wait a minute, I think we gave the president a little bit too much power here with it being able to do as he pleases with this conflict in Vietnam. Let's go ahead and start actually limiting what the president can do in these quote-unquote conflicts. Basically having to get that congressional approval for long, drawn-out American conflicts. So we are going to see an attempt from the congressional branch, the legislative branch, to actually step in and to start kind of drawing back on those presidential powers. The problem is with this is once you have already expanded the power of the president, or once you have already expanded the powers of the federal government, for an example, one of the things you probably realized is once you have that expansion of power, it's really hard to actually start tampering that power or start limiting that power. So we have the Wars Powers Act as an attempt of Congress to really limit this. But what we see in future presidencies is this idea of a conflict, a drawn out conflict, is going to happen again. Also, looking at this war, I want you guys to understand that we lost the war, by the way. Like, not even debatable. That was a war we lost. So if anyone says America never lost a war, that's not quite true. The reason being is because Americans don't really understand why we're fighting. And there are certain ideas of the war, an ideology of what this war means that Americans have, and an ideology of this war that Vietnamese have. And that's not going to be the same thing. To the Vietnamese, they're fighting for independence. They are. They're fighting back against dictators. They're fighting back against foreign countries that want to meddle in their affairs. And to them, we can really look at what the Vietnamese people at this time, and to them, a lot of times they're fighting for their liberty. And America in this war has this idea of the general American public that we are